Now, why is the Cabala suddenly of interest? It is of interest because modern science is still faced with the same problems that are said to have contributed to the suicide of Aristotle. Namely, that all of the research that is being accomplished deals with secondary processes in nature, essential processes. The principles at the roots of things are as obscure now as they were 25 centuries ago. Science has many explanations for many things, but it has never touched the problems that are dealt with essentially by the Cabala. This does not mean that the Kabbalistic answers must be correct, but they invite a thoughtfulness because no better thought is available. If this be the case, it is quite certain that modern physicists will become more interested in the subject. I have mentioned before that it was reported that Einstein was much concerned with the early philosophy of the Cabala. It was a kind of religious science, a science dealing with divine things.
This strange hyperdimensional force in the universe called life and information transfer is in the process of working itself up into a real tizzy and wrapping all space and time around itself. And what was startling and what made me think that maybe I was losing my marbles was that when you look at time that way and push these novelty graphs against the historical continuum, I reached the conclusion that we entered the last 67-year period before the collapse of the state vector. At 8:30 in the morning on August the 6th, 1945, when the atomic bomb went off over Hiroshima, you see, it was a temporal reflection of the birth of the universe. It was actually you could call it an event, which was a reincarnation of the Big Bang, because each cycle begins with a bang. And that cycle, the fact that human beings had used atomic weapons on other human beings, meant that we had entered a new era, a new epoch of moral danger, and the stakes had been raised, by a power of 64 to a new level.
So in this particular phase of living, we are now under a new threat. A few years ago, the atomic bomb was exploded for the first time. And for all intents and purposes, that explosion, or those explosions, at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were the end of human complacency. From that time on, fear began to develop within the human being. He discovered that his ingenuity has enabled him to create a means of self-destruction that is more astonishing and more final than anything he ever knew before. It was bad enough when he threw rocks at his enemies. It was even worse when he used bows and arrows against his friends. But now, the imminent development of a means of universal destruction has caused a great deal of fear.
The Friends held vigils of prayer in the room in 1953 and 1954. Back in 1946, the movement had sent Dr. Frank Laubach, Union Theological Seminary graduate and author of, quote, Letters of a Modern Mystic, unquote, to the Paris Peace Conference to lobby for the establishment of the meditation room. Speakers for the movement's meetings have included Norman Cousins, Ralph Bunche, and Frank P. Graham of the United Nations, and William Ernest Hocking and Curtly F. Mather of Harvard, all of whom have Communist Front records. The movement has included among its members Dwight David Eisenhower. The most important friend of the movement from its inception, however, has been John D. Rockefeller, Jr. A Methodist missionary, Wayman C. Huckabee, secured and received grants from John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s Davison Fund and from his New York City Riverside Church funds for 5 consecutive years, 1937 through 1941, for a health center in Hiroshima, Japan. Huckabee then became the secretary of the movement in New York in 1941 and secured 2 grants a year for the organization from the Davison Fund until it was liquidated. It is not coincidence, ladies and gentlemen, that John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s Davidson Fund and from his New York City Riverside Church funds for the years 1937 to 1941 were for the health center in Hiroshima, Japan, a city which we ultimately dropped an atomic weapon. The movement was formed, ladies and gentlemen, in 1940. The man who started it was Dr. Arthur Compton, the scientist who first brought the identified communist and accused agent espionage, Professor J. Robert Oppenheimer, into the Atomic Energy Project in 1942.
Now, in this problem also, we have another factor. What is this mysterious energy that is released for the bomb? Years ago, we had here on the Los Angeles Times a science commentator who wrote a daily column. I think his name was Lal, and he was a Hindu. But he wrote for many years. And I remember that in one of his columns, he discussed the fact that it appears that the ancient Hindus knew about the atomic bomb. He said, for example, and I suppose anyone who wants to can check it, that in the Ramayana, which is one of the great classics of India, it's a sort of like the Odyssey and the Iliad of the Greeks, a magnificent epic poem, that in the Ramayana, Sita, the wife of the avatar Rama, is kidnapped and taken to the island of Lanka, that Ravan, the evil king of Lanka, became so angry when he realized that his cause had failed that he shouted and screamed and tore and went about with such terrific combustion that, to use the statement in the book, it was as though an atom had been split.
Democritus spent a great part of his life in Egypt, and from the priests of that nation, he secured the foundation for his celebrated doctrine of atoms. That's right, folks, atoms, A-T-O-M-S. A doctrine which has survived as a scientific fact to this day.
But you see, most of us, traced our civilization to desert dwellers who invented agriculture, which gave us surpluses. So then we had to build walled enclosures to defend our surpluses from starving neighbors. And we're talking 6,000 BC at Jericho for this kind of stuff. And so we have been cut off from the natural mind longer than any other group of people on earth. This is how we are able to carry out the demonic, in the negative sense, the demonic reconstruction of the world that we have. I mean, what we have done is, if there is a sin, then we have sinned, Robert Oppenheimer said, beyond all rational argument, the physicists have known sin. And it's because they reached into the heart of matter without reverence. And their best trick was to call down the light that burns at the center of stars, and they call it down to the test centers of our deserts and on to the heads of our enemies.
But the alchemical mystery, therefore, is a kind of chain reaction. And we are beginning to appreciate that such a thing might be conceivable when we begin to think in terms of nuclear physics. We are now in the position where we realize the tremendous energy forces can be loosed which have an incredible and unknown effect upon not only living things, but upon the very fountains of life, the sources of the energies and the powers with which we are concerned. And perhaps Mrs. Atwood would have been very much impressed had she been able to live to realize that in the fission of the atom, we have a proof of the release of infinite life-like power from one tiny, almost incredibly small source. We also know that the fission that we have now achieved is only a very partial fission, and that in all probability there is enough energy in each atom to perfect or destroy an entire solar system, all depending upon use. And use is moral alchemy.
It's reported that shortly before he died, Robert Oppenheimer, looking at the picture of technology, especially nuclear technology, said it's, I'm afraid, perfectly obvious that the world is going to hell. It's going to destroy itself. It's on a collision course. The only way in which it might not go to hell is that we do not try to prevent it from doing so. Think that one over. Because it can well be argued that the major troublemakers in the world today are those people with good intentions, like the professor of theology at the University of Seville, professor of psychiatry at wherever you will.
Thus, in some mysterious way, the great experiment must first be performed in man and then in the world. These are the two great laboratories, the laboratory of the human soul and the laboratory of the cosmos. Whenever the rule is found actually and absolutely in one, it will be applicable to the other. In this pattern, then, the search for the inward transmutation must be a search after a science of the handling, the directing, the multiplying, the expanding, the extending, and the transforming of light.
Rent or purchase a film called Things to Come. It was made many, many years ago. In that film, you will recognize, if you are an astute student, you will recognize many of the things that I've discussed in our Mystery Babylon series and that I am revealing to you tonight. You'll also see a symbol, a globe with wings, a globe with wings.